So we're going to use Maya to create a wire and bead toy. And this is basically three parts. It's the base, the wire, and the beads. What we are going to do is we're going to create a box with a little bit of depth to it, doesn't matter what it is, and we're going to be working on first putting in the holes. Now, in order to put the holes, we need to have more geometry. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to go use the multi-cut tool, and to get to that you're going to use shift right click, and going to the multi-cut we're going to hold in control, and we're going to basically start cutting 3 by 3 sections. These 3 by 3 sections should give us enough geometry to basically add in a hole where we want. Now we can put this anywhere we want, and it's ultimately just I'm going to put in 4 here, so as you can see I cross thread it and basically put that. So once we have these holes in there, these sections, we're going to go in the face, and I'm going to hold tab and just basically paint the section of hole in here. And we're going to go right click and go to circularize, and what that's going to do is create the circular shape that we're going to use to put in the wire. Now you can resize this, I'm just doing this for processes, and then same thing here, I'm just going to keep going from next to next and basically put these 3 holes in. So you can see I'm doing the same thing repeatedly. Right click on it, shift right click, and then go to circularize. Now if you use the hotkey G, you can just redo the last action, and that will work as well. Alright, now what we're going to do is we're going to select these, and by holding shift and scale we're going to make them extrude a shape inward, and then I'm going to switch to the move tool with W, and holding shift in I'll extrude those downward twice. I'll release the mouse button but still hold shift in. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to keep the edge loop. So when I hit 1 on the keyboard, what will happen is it will create the actual geometry. When I hit 3 on the keyboard, what it'll do is it will create a subdivision of that geometry without actually changing the geometry. And I'm just going through extruding these inward to give it a little bit of edge loop, and once I'm done I can move around the placement and things like that. Other than that, this is pretty repetitious, and it should be pretty easy to do to get your base going on. Now once that's done, we need to basically see how the model looks in a higher poly, so I'm going to hit 3 on the keyboard, and that will subdivide it so that it can ultimately show me what the shape is going to look like. And you can see that the edges are not rounded, it's not square, so I need to put reinforcing edges in there in order to do that. So I'm going to hold in shift right click and go to the menu, and then what we're going to do is hold in control, and it will allow us to do an edge loop. And so from there we can add edge loops to the outer edges, and you'll notice that once I do that, the edges become a lot more harder and more defined, even though it has a little bit of a curve to it. And then once that's done, I'm ultimately going to start working on the wire. The wire is going to be 2 parts. The first part is I'm just taking a cylinder, and I'm creating a little cylinder here, and I'm going to go into the attribute editor and change the number of sides to, I think it's 6. I don't need anything more than that. It's perfectly fine. And then I'm going to shift click and drag, and that'll create a duplicate. And so with that idea, now I need to make a curve. I'm just going to move these down a little bit. I'm going to make a curve now in the orthogonal views. And that'll be the easiest way to start with curves in anything you have to create. So I'm just going to use the curve tool here, and it is a little bit different than a Bezier curve from like Illustrator, and it's going to basically allow me to create certain points. Then I can kind of move these points around and it'll automatically curve around there. So it works perfect for these particular things. And ultimately, I'm just gonna kind of click and drag and move this around. And again, this is where you spend more time getting everything lined up and a little bit more perfection going on. Next, if you do need to edit the curve, you just have to right select it and then right click and go in and edit one of the curve handles. And you'll notice here I'm just shift right clicking here and editing the curve. You'll notice these blue dots or these purple dots here. What they're doing is they're basically allowing me to move the curve around. So you can move those around and those 2 points will control that curve. You can angle this, move it around, but ultimately get that lined up where you want your holes to be kind of put up. Now I'm just going to speed this up about 4 times just so you don't have to bear with me. But ultimately all I'm doing is just going in and moving these parts so that I can control where my curve is going to be. Once that's done, I'm going to take those little cylinders that I made and I'm going to move those to the ends of the curves that I've created. And in order to do this, I'm just going to move this around. Now, if you hold in C, it should snap to a curve. However, Maya's user interface sometimes can be a little bit wonky, so you kind of have to move around and double check things. But ultimately, if you hold C and middle mouse button, it'll snap into place. V will do vertices and X will do grid points. So that will kind of help you if you're doing any sort of contained construction. Once these are in place, what you're going to do is you're going to go in and go into the face mode, select the faces, and essentially select all the faces that we want to extrude. So I'm doing this by selecting the whole top half and then holding in control to deselect the bottom half. Now I'm going to basically hold shift and grab that curve as well as the faces that I have, and I'm going to hit extrude, shift right click and go extrude. And you'll notice there's something kind of wonky here, and that's ultimately because if my face is not in the right spot, what's going to happen is it's going to kind of give you some issues. So make sure that the face of your scene or of your cylinder basically lines up with the end of the curve, and actually a little bit before of that is preferential. Then what I'm doing is when I extrude, I'm adding 100 faces. Now if you middle mouse click and use the slider, it will only slide up to 25, but you can always type in any number that you want in there. So here again, selecting the face, selecting the curve with shift, and then going and selecting extrude and then putting in 100 gives me a really nice curve. Now, however, you'll notice that the other one's broke, so I'm going to have to basically go back and redo that one from scratch. So I'll delete the curve, hitting the delete key, and then basically create another cylinder, line it up and make sure it's in the right spot, and then extrude it with my faces selected and the curve selected. Now if you are running into struggles where it's not lining up or something like that when you're holding C, you can always grab the other objects and add them to a layer and basically put them into something else. So here I'm going to object mode, clicking this new layer button and then right clicking it to add layer to selected object, hitting the V to hide the visibility, and then from there I should be able to snap this in place. And again, make sure it's low enough, make sure it's in the right spot so that when you do extrude it, it will work appropriately. And so once that's done, I'm ultimately going through and making sure that things line up properly. And again, doing the same thing, selecting my faces, hit shift and select the curve, and then shift right click and curve. Adding in more segments, I'm changing that to 100, and it will turn out to be pretty decent. Then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to just, once I'm done with this, I can unhide that layer and then move the pieces around where I need them to be. The next part of this is ultimately making sure everything's in object level, and now I'm going to create the blocks that go on the wires. And I'm going to do three different blocks. I'm going to do square, circular, and triangular. With the square, what I'm going to do is go into the attributes panel, make sure it's evenly done, 2 by 2 by 2, and then I'm going to add some segments to there. Really quickly, I think I'm going to add 5 segments, and then if I hit F on the keyboard, I can focus on the key. So then I'm going to go into the right face mode and basically hit tab and select my faces. I can go to the bottom, do the same thing, holding in tab, I'll just paint the faces that I want selected. I'm going to hit delete, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into edge mode, and I'm going to double click on the edge and turn it into circular, and I'm going to again double click on the edge and then shift right click and go to circular. Now that'll give me a circular pole. And then what I can do is I can grab these two edges and hold in shift and scale, and then that will extrude a face inward. And then what I can do is make sure I have the two edges again, shift right click and bridge, and that will connect things together. Now what I did was ultimately gives me the edges of the cylinder to basically, keep a stable foundation. If you feel that the edges of the square are too round, then what you can do is you can go shift right click and multi-cut, and then holding in control you can create edge loops. And then if they're a little bit awkward, double click in it and it'll select an edge loop, and then I can scale that edge loop perfectly straight. And ultimately when you're done with that, you can hit 3 on the keyboard and it should maintain a nice form for this particular block. Now there are ways to clean up the edges, but I'm not going to go into that. That's more of edge modeling and stuff like that. We're going to do the sphere next. The sphere is pretty easy. What we're going to do is going to an orthographic view here and select the top faces of this. So you'll notice I go and just zoom into this face here. And I'm going to select the top faces of this, and I'm going to hit delete, and that'll create a hole in the mesh. And I'm going to select the bottom faces and hit delete, and that'll create a hole in the mesh. Going into edge mode, I'm going to double click both of these, and I'm going to go, I like working in perspective, so I'm going to go here, and I'm going to shift extrude, and that's going to extrude that little edge in there to basically hold that edge when I do the subdivide. Again, bridging, pretty easy to do, and we have our sphere. Alright, now that that's done, we're going to work on the triangle. This is going to be a little bit different, and sometimes abstract thinking works best in 3D modeling. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a circle, and I'm going to take this circle and go in and basically narrow it down to 3 sides, which turns everything into a triangle. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to subdivide the base here. So I'm going to only do one side first. What I'm going to do is go to the vertice, click on that, and I'm going to chamfer this. So by chamfering this, that's going to give me a little triangle. And then for what I'm going to do there is I'm going to scale that bigger or smaller depending on my needs. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab those vertices here, and I'm going to do the same thing as well. And what that's going to do is going to push all the triangles so that it gives me a little bit more geometry. Now this isn't the perfect way to do it. There's many other ways to do it, but we're learning this, so it's more of a process. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply circular the bottom, and then I'm going to delete the bottom, and what I'm going to do now is delete the hole in the center. So with that in mind, I'm going to then need to make some adjustments to the edges, and what we can do is we can grab this edge, all these faces, and extrude them outward, and you'll notice that these bottom faces will be black. This often happens when you're extruding something or when you're defining mesh, and to do this we're going to go into the mesh category here, and I'm going to simply go in and hit reverse, and that will flip the normals. Think of it as like a one-sided mirror. So with that in mind, now I've got this object, but the problem is when I subdivide this object, it's going to look really horrible because there's no foundations, there's no supporting edges. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to do a multi-cut, and I'm going to do it a couple different ways. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in and add just some corners here, and that will give me the reinforcement that I need on these edges. Again, hitting Control and with the multi-cut tool, that'll give me the edges I need. So with those edges in, then I'm going to go on the top here and simply cut from vertex to vertex. The vertices will highlight, and then that will give you kind of the edge reinforcement that you need to keep that triangular shape. I still need to add an edge loop on the top and the bottom, and that'll give me the outer corners. That'll work just fine. And then you'll notice that hole gets kind of weird, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go in and select all of that, and I'm going to chamfer that. And so that's going to give me the edges that I need. So another thing to do is I need to reinforce this. So the thing about polygons is the more polygons you have with more than 4 spaces or 4 sides, called an n-gon, anything more than that is basically going to kind of break down your structure. The more issues with 5 sides or more, or triangles, that's going to really make your systems kind of struggle. So I'm going to add in some more edge loops here. I'm doing the bottom edge loops, same thing we did for the top, except for just doing this to the bottom. And again, sometimes it's easier just to rotate around or move things around. I'm hitting enter after each multi-cut, that way I can end that multi-cut. And now I just need to reinforce that outer edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go in here and grab this edge and add a little bit of an edge loop with the multi-cut tool in the top and bottom, and that will kind of refine that. So next is, you'll notice that this is subdivided and it looks a lot better. Just because it looks good doesn't mean the mesh is 100%. So sometimes you have to go through and kind of fix things. So I'm going to add a edge loop here, and I'm going to go in and basically shift right click with the multi-cut, and then if I hold in shift, it'll actually do it during the center. It'll lock it in the center, so it'll be a quick snap here. And then I'm going to just go on through the top, and by clicking these 2 pieces like so, I'm going to allow me to change everything into quads and triangles. Now, triangles are not the best by any means, but for this exercise, it works for what we're doing. I just want you to understand that try and get rid of those n-gons. I've always had issues where Maya will start crashing when you get too many of them in your scene. And then ultimately, once this is done here, we are done with this project. The only thing left to do is to grab this and go into the object levels and basically move them according to putting them on the wires and such like that. Now, I'm just grabbing the edges and I'm moving this down so the block is a little bit smaller, but always make sure you're out of sub-object mode when you try and move things. You'll notice that my pivot point is a little bit awkward because I've deleted things, I've moved things around. So if you hit the insert key, you can actually move that around, and by hitting the insert again, it will actually change your pivot, and then you can get out of that pivot mode. So you'll notice here I hit V, and what that does is it allows me to snap to a vertice. So it's not being a true center, but it's close enough for this particular object. Alright, so once this is in place, you'll notice that one of the issues that I have is that my edge or my wire is basically in the wrong spot, so they're overlapping. So I want to fix it, but I don't want to have to move all those pieces of geometry. So I'm selecting where I have it, and I'm going to go into the move tool and double click it, and I'm going to open the soft selection tab, and with that checked, I'm going to allow, basically I can move that hole without causing too much damage to everything else. And then just make sure you uncheck it, because otherwise it'll cause issues down the road. And so once you're done, you'll have something similar to this, and go crazy with it and have fun. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or you need some help, let me know.